Yeah, welcome back to Think Tech. I'm Jay Fidel. This is Global Connections, and we're talking today about the international drift to authoritarianism with Carlos Juarez, who joins us from Texas for now. But soon enough, he's coming back to Hawaii. We can hardly wait, actually. Carlos, I want to start our discussion with talking about another dimension of the conversation we were going to have.
Mhm.
We were going to talk about how individual nations in this world are drifting toward authoritarianism to the point where you can count them on both hands now, and you can see that it has a life of its own, and maybe in the days to come, they'll be more attractive to people or more successful than democracies. But I want to add something else that actually reveals to me another process within that. We know, for example, that Russia has been moving on its neighbors to the west and the south and trying to re-expand to the days of glory. And that brings authoritarianism to those countries, or in any event reinforces authoritarianism in those countries. But there's an article that a friend of mine sent me from a English language newspaper in Asia that I was just reading before the show that is absolutely scary, and that is about Taiwan, which is a democracy, an enviable, admirable democracy for a long time already. And the Chinese, Xi Jinping and his generals are making much more noise lately to suggest that they may soon take over Taiwan by force, regardless of the wishes of the American military. This would be a huge change in the Western Pacific, for sure. But it would also be an expansion of authoritarian government from China to a democracy. So it's part of that same drift. I submit to you, it's part of the same drift. Your thoughts about this?
Well, it is. It's an interesting, let's say, addition, or maybe we could almost say a variation on authoritarian rule, because some of what we'll talk about ahead in a moment is this, indeed, this rise of populism. And I'll distinguish that a little more from the broader concept of authoritarian rule, because I think what you're speaking to in Taiwan, it's interesting to put that in perspective. You put Taiwan as a democracy. It certainly is by any objective measure, and it fits into that. But it is also a relatively new one. It's only since the 80s that it, effectively democratized, if you will. So the authoritarian rule that was there before, military rule, I guess I want to suggest the vestiges, sort of, even those who ruled and were governed at that time are still here with us today. It's only been a generation. And if you look at the world at a broader level, five of the world's very largest democracies, the population centers, are run today by authoritarian leaders from India, Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, and many of those are democracies, procedural, civil, governments, and so on. But increasingly, a steady erosion of democratic norms and ideals and institutions. What I want to say quickly is that I think sometimes we can get a little bit confused or messy, or in some cases, you often have some people using it, and some either journalists or even analysts using the term populism and authoritarianism interchangeably, sometimes overusing them, and sometimes simply misapplying them. So sometimes it's good to step back and say, what are we really talking about? And certainly, China taking over Taiwan by force is certainly against the democratic will of the people. And yet, in many of these democracies, you often have the use of the democratic institutions in ways that can simply, I guess you could say, justify or put through authoritarian changes in a democratic process, whether it's legitimate or not, and those are in the eye of the beholder, but essentially using democratic institutions. So let me maybe on that point say that the variation of authoritarian rule that we see nowadays is more likely to be a leader who is using democracy, twisting it, distorting it, and effectively eroding it. And so that's different from maybe previous times when rather than taking away democracy, they were simply variations of authoritarian rule coming, without that background context. Now, let me leave it at that because it could get more confusing, but I want us to understand that. And then separately, what is this notion of populism, where we see a lot of populist leaders today? And that's another maybe angle that I want us to talk a little bit about. But let me just turn back to you and let me see what additional questions or thoughts you have on what I've just shared.
Well, I think most of us were really not following this until Trump came around. And then we saw him dismantling democracy. It was clear to anybody who went to high school that he was dismantling democracy. Okay, and then so we became sensitive to that, and to a certain degree, the press was making us aware, and the division of the press was making us aware of the populists as well. And then we started looking at American history and learning more about populism, and we were threatened by it, but realized that it was embedded in American history, so maybe it would reverse itself as it has in the past. But then it got more serious, and he did things that were more outrageous. And to resist the transfer of power the way he is now, and with the big lie, is just it is a direct assault on the democratic system and the Constitution. Okay, then in the process, we look at other countries. I guess, I wasn't reading so much about what was happening in Europe and Eastern Europe before, but now I've become aware. Maybe it's because of what's happening in the US and because of the popularity of the issue in the press. But it seems to me that it's not just the US. The US is definitely moving right. To find out that 70 million people voted in favor of this guy, and he's a racist and extremist, and worse, he's a traitor to the country. Now come to find that the same kinds of things and directions are happening in Europe and a number of countries there, then you wonder what's going on, and really that's what I wanted to examine with you. What is it going? Is it got something to do with the air, the water? Where is humanity these days? We know better, but maybe events have somehow opened the possibility that democracy ain't so great. Maybe Trump has sent that message. Democracy ain't so great, so they get on the populist bandwagon. And right now, I think we have a bandwagon that is showing that people are not so happy with democracy.
Yeah, no, I think you've touched on many, many key points there, and indeed it is this bandwagon because we're seeing it, and roughly with the onset of Brexit 2016, the election that same fall of Trump, and simultaneously the rise of populist leaders in Central and Eastern Europe, and Poland and in Hungary, Duterte down in the Philippines, in Spain, in Austria, far right parties, and even in Germany now, suddenly no longer on the fringe, but becoming political entities. Now, again, I want to make clear that we do see, some of those are elements of nativist politics, driven by, often very singular issues, the migration question, the culture wars, et cetera. But I want to distinguish that from what we might see more in terms of this populism that takes on a leader who becomes essentially a populist leader. And that is a situation where you have the use of a language that frames politics as a battle between the will of the ordinary people, the popular classes, and some kind of corrupt or self-serving elites. Now, never mind that sometimes those leaders may themselves be from that same system or elites, but they're using this language and rallying, often very simplistic. And again, populism has been around for a long time, but today we see a variation that has harnessed the use of social media in ways that are, giving it a tool and helping to reinforce, because it is remarkable how much it becomes a language and sort of a dialogue issue, or maybe to put it differently, in terms of what we study in the academic area, in international relations theory, for example, we use the term constructivism to refer to theories and approaches that may focus on this case, like language, use of syntax, and populists are very good at this, at simplifying things and putting it in, and almost like framing the issues. And it is, again, in use of language that is being constructed to shape opinions. Now, these things get real messy and tedious, but bottom line is populists are those who are trying to say, hey, I've got the solution. I'm with you, the people. It's those elites, those self-serving, corrupt elites that are the problem. Then the challenge is that they begin to, in order to survive and stay in office, they have to quickly get rid of anybody who doesn't agree with them. And they start using the court system, the military in ways that become deeply politicized, deeply polarizing, and deeply partisan. And that is not democracy.
We see that happening. I saw a very interesting piece on YouTube the other day involving three people talking about the Holocaust and talking about the development of extremism, call it that, Nazism, in Europe and Germany in the 30s. And there was one fellow, he was a survivor. He was very impressive. He was a teacher in a college somewhere in Washington, D.C. area. The other one was the historian in the Holocaust Museum. The third one was an academician from somewhere else in the country. And the fellow who was the Polish survivor was the most impressive to me. He said, look, you have to remember that in development of extremism, there are three ends. And I mention this because I think it's not only the development of extremism, it's the development of populism too. Same thing. The first N is need, that you are needy, that you feel that your life has not treated you well, your country has not treated you well, you're unhappy about your circumstances. And that was true after World War I in Germany, for sure.
Of course.
The second end is narrative. And narrative is the story that takes you out of that, satisfies your need. And in the case of Germany, it was I'll make you the most powerful country in Europe. I'll make you glorious. I'll give you the old days of German glory. I'm going to give it to you, and you will see this solves your need. You can bet you'll be better off. And the third end, and people migrate to that. They navigate right into that.
That's right.
And the third one, which was very interesting and is especially appropriate now, is the N for network. And we have social media. We have so many networks where we don't talk to other people who are our peers necessarily, but somebody is the hub of the wheel. Somebody talks to us, and that person is very influential. That person is a leader, maybe even a president, and that person, resonates with our populist mentality. So if you put all those three together and you march down that path, what you get is in the 30s in Germany, and by the way, education is a big part of this. Educate them while they're young, and flush out any democratic, sensibilities in favor of populism. So what you got in Germany in the 30s was a very successful operation to turn the German country, and it wasn't everybody. It was enough people to meet the tipping point, though, into a Nazi country. And I suggest the same thing exists with populism, or whatever you want to call it, Trumpism here, that you had those things with people who were needy. People wanted the narrative of, not letting any immigrant class replace them. And they had the benefit of social media where they could all talk to each other and plan insurrections in Washington and all kinds of nefarious, deadly, dastardly things. And so the Arbor Plate in this great experiment is still the same as it was in the 30s. It still works the same way. And I think it's been very successful. And leaders who tend to go right have found the truth. They have found out the best practices on how to do this, including get rid of your opposition one way or the other.
Well, let me just add real quickly to that, Jay, that while we do see a majority of this populism and sort of anti-elitism on the right, you do have leftist populists of various types, whether it's what was previously Hugo Chavez, now Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, Mexico's AMLO, López Obrador. He is very much a self-proclaimed left-wing populist, but in a curious way, much like Trump, much like Bolsonaro, the leader of Brazil, they end up sort of connecting, in terms of both their overall strategies and tactics and their rationale. But it's a curious, almost like strange bedfellows. But here, let me make clear. I mean, I think we spoke just a moment about how there is this rising trend, and there's an interesting database I just recently discovered known as the Global Populism Database, and it's the most up-to-date, the most comprehensive and reliable repository of populist discourse in the world, and the basis on which we can, we're able to report today that the number of populist leaders has more than doubled since the early 2000s, so it's a growing trend. If we were here 20, 30 years ago, we would talk about the democratization, how, let's say Latin America goes from 3 or 4 democracies. Today, it's got 24. Well, some of those are now eroding and stepping back as there are in other places. We've got the Turkish leader, of course, very firmly in place and his variants of populism. And so this, populism is interesting. And I mentioned this database. It helps us to build a data visualization on how reliant, these leaders are on the language and the very, this. It is quite scary, and while the tendency is to the right, no doubt, but we do see cases on the left that are just
but
much
the
same.
The process is not democracy.
No,
it may be on the left with left initiatives to satisfy the people, I suppose, in large sense. But at the end of the day, decisions are made differently. they're made by fiat, and dealing with people who have opposing views is by fiat, or worse. And so, I think there are things happening here. One thing I'd like to suggest to you, see your reaction. I'm not sure of this. Is when we have reached a level of complexity in our society, and I mean not only the United States but elsewhere. Our daily lives, if you will, you find the daily life of an American is not all that different than the daily life of a Frenchman or a German or an Italian or even Eastern European. They all have cell phones. They all talk to each other. They use social media. It's very similar, okay? But it's very complex too. And it deprives the individual person of the kind of connection we used to have. And that is talking to our friends and peers, arguing out points of reference and so forth. What do you want to call it? The public conversation is different. That's one thing. Namely, that we live in a more and more complex world, and people are lazy. They don't want to actually spend the time and energy engaging on, what do you want to call it? The connection between government and citizen. The other thing, I suppose, is that government, including especially authoritarians, have more tools at their disposal. You mentioned before they have democratic tools, but they also have technological tools. I mean, it was of no small consequence that Trump was able to talk to 100 million people by Twitter every day, 10 times a day if he wanted. This enhances his power. Call me what you want, but spell my name right. Everybody was thinking and talking about him. Every media was filled with him, sucking out the oxygen in every moment. This changes things.
Yeah.
So these factors have played it. And finally, the last point I make to you is the education of the kids. Just as Hitler deprived them of what do you want to call it, an open-minded education. I think whether it's intentional or not, we have an educational system, and you're involved in it as an educator, that has declined over the years. And those kids go to school, they don't come out better citizens. They simply do not. They do not know what you and I are talking about here today.
Yeah. No, I mean, and just to follow on that, I mean, that is the sad reality that today we don't have a sufficient understanding of the global interconnected world that we're all a part of. That decisions that are happening in, the Gaza Strip or in Russia or in Indonesia are affecting our lives. And unfortunately, the education system has been pushed and pulled in different ways for different reasons, and often understanding of the world, of culture, societies. And moreover, I mean, even this tendency of populism we're talking about is often directly linked to sort of the clash of cultures, the movement of people, migrants who are coming from different places, and kind of raising this nativism, if you will. People want to have a sense of both belonging, but also owning who they are and what they are. When they see differences, different people, different cultures, values, it erodes. Let me say it. It reframes questions of, let's say, loyalties and sovereignty. And so leaders will harness that, say, hey, to be a true X or Y, follow me, and we're going to, take this path that's going to, the problems are caused often. And this is, again, a demagogue and a populist, someone else over there that you can point your finger at. And it's not to say that all populists or authoritarian leaders are necessarily pushing the race or ethnic buttons. That just happens to be one of many that can be used. If it's not ethnic, it could be, again, the self-serving elites or the corrupt elites or the old system, and then basically
scapegoats. Somebody
exactly.
else.
Yeah, and of course you speak to this question of the role of social media, and that again has just become a very effective tool. I repeat, as an educator, I can remember when the early days of the internet coming on board, this initial sense of excitement that, wow, it's going to democratize information that are available to us instantly, and look where we are today. Increasingly polarized more. People are only reading what they want and reinforcing it, not looking at the first picture. And maybe as students, again, what's missing is this need to step back and think more critically and analytically, not just click and forward and share and things like that. But that's the world we're in. And so leaders, populist leaders, harness that, and they use the same tools of social media to effectively define the narrative, shape opinion, and to control information.
We would not have been able to anticipate this. Back in the day of the printing press, everybody felt that the written word, or the printed word, more appropriate, had greater authority than the spoken word. And indeed, the courts are loaded with rules that elevate the written word and the printed word. That's been the way for 500 years. And then when the internet comes in, and social media especially, people somehow equate that to the printed written word because it's there on the page.
Somebody wrote it, yes.
And they did not think in 1995 or 6 when it took over that it would be lies.
Yeah.
They had no idea that we would be besieged in lies like this. Yeah. And what the effect of those lies would be, that namely that people believe it. And so it has legitimized the lie. And I think the legitimization of the lie is part of what we are talking about here today. The migration to authoritarian government depends on the ability of the authoritarian to tell the people whatever he or she wants and have them believe it, even if they know, and they know in their hearts, even if they do have critical thinking, but they accept the lie as being in league with him, being part of his power structure, and they don't want to say, nor afraid to deny the lie. This is a great concern. And my question to you as we go down to the last inning here is this. It seems from the past few years that at least for now, at least in our lifetimes, they should be long, this is going to continue, Carlos. There's nothing that indicates that we are not moving in a further authoritarian, populist, whatever you want to call it, trend in this country and in the world. I mean, 70-odd million people voted for him a second time after he had bashed the country for 4 years. It's quite remarkable. They still supported him. It was remarkable enough in 2016, but to have it happen again in 2020 is absolutely stupefying. So what does this mean? So it seems inevitable that we are moving, we and other countries similarly situated on the continuum are moving to, extremism and to racism and to populism and all this negative, self-interest and failure to recognize the common good. That's what it is. So the question I put to you is, how long is this going to last? Where does it go? And how? This is not easy. And how do we, as hopefully the thinking people, ameliorate it?
No easy answers, because again, there are a lot of things happening at the same time. It's almost like you're playing chess, with 4 people, different levels, different times. On one hand, of course, we need to highlight it, spotlight it, talk about it, and certainly civil society groups, civil, communities need to try as best they can to step up. That's not easy. It often comes at a price. In many of these places, it can mean death or violence for resisting the existing rule of the law, if you will. Beyond that, gosh, it's hard to say, but there are places where, sadly, it probably has to reach some, future still not there yet, ugly status. In other words, there's not sufficient tipping point, if you will, to change that. But I think in others, I mean, you do see it coming and presenting itself, let's say, because if we're talking about democracies that are, let's say, eroding, they still have elections. And that's where there is a role for the international community to legitimize or to criticize, when things are not proper, and that, needs to happen consistently, because that will erode, let's say, some of the credibility of leaders. Right now, as we speak, this coming weekend, Mexico is having a very important election. It's the midterm, essentially, of the president's 6-year term, non-re-election. They have only one fixed 6-year. And this leader, we've often talked about, López Obrador, a populist, a left-wing populist, but again, sharing a lot of the aspects of others. He is not up for the election, but his party and many of the governorships that support him, et cetera. So it's an interesting test to see, and most indications are he'll still win, but maybe with some erosion of the power he got 3 years ago. But that said, what I'm getting at is that you're going to continue to see this more likely in democracies that are kind of, at the same time that they're being democratic, they're also chipping away, because what you have is leaders that are basically, well, what is it they're doing? Well, they're basically destroying the institutions of transparency and the systems of checks and balances. They're rewriting the constitutional rules to kind of change them, often without clear, let's say, acceptable, public feedback or input. It's pushed through, let's say, in an anti-democratic way. So, gosh, the solutions aren't going to be easy. I think we need to hope for the best. But in the end of the day, each of these different places where this is happening, it has to come from within. It's not going to be solved by outside intervention. And yet, how much can one do? There is a
Well,
connection.
I think people aren't motivated. They're not
Yeah.
motivated, and I'll tell you why. They think, and this is probably the worst aspect of this whole affair. They think things are going to be okay, and moving toward an authoritarian government. Same thing happened in Germany. Moving toward an authoritarian government, especially if you have the need and the narrative and the network, you think it's okay. It's going to be okay. And your life will, you continue to believe your life will be okay or better. But okay works. Then you realize, you and I both realize, and this is the scariest part, that it is coming for all of us. Nobody will be unaffected by an authoritarian government. Nobody will escape. And your life is not going to be better. There's going to be inequities all around you, and you will suffer a loss of personal freedom and civil liberties. The country will change for the worse under an authoritarian government, unless and he happens to be a benign authoritarian, which is rare, if not logically impossible. When they say power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the probability is, as you move right into an authoritarian model, it affects more people in more adverse ways. I don't think people in this country have a clue about that. What do you think?
Well, no, I would share that same perspective in the sense that again, it's this interdependence, and just look at the neighbor of the U.S. to the south, Mexico. Mexico continues right now eroding its democratic values, and it is happening right now. There is a deterioration of the institutions, the rule of law, and human rights are not getting better. Indeed, the current president, again, I'm just using him as an example of authoritarianism. It happens to be from the left, but again, we see more of this on the right. But it's this mismanagement and it's this framing of things. But the bottom line is, if Mexico doesn't do well, if it kind of gets plunged into political and economic crisis, the U.S. suffers as well. There are losers all around. The same can be said about other places. Again, the erosion of democratic values, and maybe let me add that one of the pushbacks is always that, well, how should we, from the West, from the sort of democratic world, be somehow expecting and assuming that everyone has to go the same path? And there's some argument to that. I mean, no, we do expect and assume all countries go through this similar process. At the end of the day, I think was it maybe Benjamin Franklin or one of those founders who spoke about how messy democracies are. I mean, they're inherently messy. The problem is now that messiness can sometimes turn into violence and just instead of going one or two steps back, 3 or 4 steps back. And we've seen that happening now, sadly. So we are seeing democracies erode, and we're seeing authoritarianism appealing as a solution. It's a quick fix. And it's also just because, again, I think this greater interconnectedness that we have, the global connections we always talk about, it has left many people feeling uncomfortable and looking for a scapegoat, an easy blame. And an authoritarian leader comes in, and the solution is blaming that, or maybe it's the model or for like, and so that's where the appeal comes for many. And sadly, I guess I'm going to say there's no simple solution. I think we're going to continue to see this. It's probably going to get worse before it gets any better because there's almost like a modeling going on. Many others that look around and see and learn how to use social media, how to play the game in ways that keep them in power. Because what is political power about, or what are politicians, political leaders about? It's about survival, about staying in office. Hopefully to be good, but all too often, especially over time, just to stay in power for the sheer greed of power.
It's about arrogance. It's about lying. It's about double down on the lie. And the problem is that these things help an authoritarian stay in office. So it's hard to say what's going to happen, but it reminds me, and this goes back to the issue between China and Taiwan, is that you have to smell the future. And that's why a conversation like this is important to me anyway, to smell the future. And the future is, as you said, it's the possibility of violence. How do you restore the norms of the founders? How do you restore a democratic republic? Benjamin Franklin walking out of Liberty Hall, which was in secret, was asked by a woman, well, what kind of government are we going to have? And Dr. Franklin, and he said, Madam, a republic, if you can keep it. If
That's
you can
right.
keep it. And it requires the understanding and the action and the faithful, the faithful activity every day of every citizen. And I don't think we have that. So therefore, you and I will have to have this conversation later and connect the dots.
Yes, and in the meanwhile, maybe back channels, do our best to try to, well, I'm kind of with a tongue in cheek here saying that, gosh, I think with all of us, and it's incumbent on, I guess, civil society groups, NGOs, individuals, thinking people to try to mobilize, and yet easier said than done, because the forces that are pushing the other way towards authoritarian rule are powerful, they're in power, and they have the advantage in many places.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. I look forward to all of our conversations to come, and I look forward to your return to Hawaii. That'll be wonderful.
Great. Always a pleasure, Jay. Aloha.
Aloha. Aloha.